Hi, and welcome to another episode of the Medtech Matters podcast, where we learn about someone impacting the medical device industry. I'm Sean Fensky, Editor-in-Chief of MPO and host of the podcast. Today we're speaking with Dr. Greg Nicola, the Chief Medical Officer at NeuTigers. Dr. Nicola, thanks for joining us. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thank you for having me. Excited to talk about what we're doing.
So let's do just that. Can you tell me what is NeuTigers?
So NeuTigers is a artificial intelligence application company that's a spin-off of Princeton University. The intellectual property, which are specific, very cutting-edge neural networks, which we'll get into, are only licensed to NeuTigers, and all the innovations made by the Princeton Research Lab are licensed to NeuTigers. The uniqueness of the specific neural networks I'm talking about is that they're so compact they can work on edge devices. So they can be put on a watch or a telephone or a sensor inside a foot, like a shoe. So they're so tiny they can be placed anywhere, and they don't need cloud access to make an inference. They're so tiny that they don't even need to access the cloud to make any decision tree that they're programmed to do.
So is that what is meant by when I read a few things where it said that NeuTigers is shrinking AI? Is that kind of what that means?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We've made AI not in a cloud-based application, but instead a edge-based application. And you can imagine, well, maybe not a lot of industry needs edge-based AI. What cloud is perfectly adequate. But there are some that have security concerns and latency concerns where decisions or inferences have to be made very rapidly, or that the security is so vital that sending additional data over the cloud really doesn't make sense for that specific type of industry. And of course, the one we've targeted is healthcare.
And let's get into that. How is this technology being used in the healthcare space?
So where we're beta tested a number of products and in research with a number of others. What we've done is we've deployed these tiny neural networks into at-home monitoring devices and wearable medical devices. And we're agnostic to the manufacturer of the specific hardware. We can integrate with just about anything, either on the device itself or just do a simple Bluetooth connection to a cell phone and an application on the cell phone. And by monitoring or putting neural networks on these devices, we can make inferences about the patient's health very rapidly. And if you don't mind, I'll give you an example of one of the research projects that we are pretty deep inside France right now.
Yeah, please do, because I think it would help clarify exactly what you're talking about.
Sure. So one of the disease states we're working with is sickle cell anemia. Sickle cell anemia is a genetic disorder where most of our blood cells in people without the disorder are round and they smoothly move through blood vessels. In sickle cell anemia, occasionally they have a crisis and their blood vessels go from rounded shape to sickle in shape. Those sickle cell type blood cells block the arteries, and they can get strokes and heart attacks and very bad chest pain, and it's a quite painful condition. The issue with sickle cell anemia is the patients usually know they're about to have a crisis by how they feel, and they can start some intervention at home, which includes just simply drinking a lot of water or inhaling more clear or more pure oxygen, relaxing. There's some medications. But often by the time they have any sense of symptoms, it's too late, and they have to go to the hospital and be treated more rigorously in an inpatient, expensive hospital setting. Well, with wearable medical devices and machine learning inferences, we're finding we can detect crisis earlier than the patient can, meaning that we can implement therapy earlier. And our hope, and we haven't gotten to this phase of the trial, our hope is that that earlier intervention will lead to less hospitalizations. And that exact paradigm can be used in many other disease states. So we like to call it, the medical terminology is acute exacerbation of chronic disease. That's our market. So representative examples are sickle cell anemia, congestive heart failure, where someone's heart isn't beating quite as well and they start getting swelling everywhere. That's a chronic condition that has acute worsening events. So in essence, we are creating an early warning system where our software, which is neural networks paired with these type of wearable devices, have created a whole new layer of information for patients and care providers to look at to start therapy earlier.
So is the AI portion that NeuTigers is providing, you said you're hardware agnostic, but you're basically just dependent on the hardware to have the proper technology, such as a sensor or whatever it is. Right. The hardware has to be in place in order to detect whatever it is they that wants to be monitored or kept track of.
That's correct. And in some cases, for example, we've done research in COVID and sickle cell and mental health disorders and diabetes. In some cases, the sensors are very similar across those diseases, and others we add other sensors that might not be built into one device. So an example is one of the smart watches we use has something called skin galvanization, which is how well your skin conducts, and it's a very good sign of stress. It also has thermal temperature of the skin. It has something called interbeat interval, which is the intervals between heartbeats. And we didn't feel that was going to be quite enough for some of our experiments, and we wanted to learn what else we could add to that. So we added something called a pulse oximeter, which is another little device you can wear on your finger, and it determines how well your blood's picking up oxygen. And we looked at blood pressures. The uniqueness of neural networks is you don't necessarily need all those data inputs and all those sensors to make inferences. I'll reflect on our COVID-19 project, which early in the crisis, we launched experiments in Italy where people wore our devices and then tried to see if we can build algorithms that could detect the symptomology of COVID. And we were pretty successful. We have peer-reviewed literature out. We're undergoing emergency use authorization through the FDA. It's not a commercially available product in the United States yet because of the EUA application. But what we found is that we can build maybe 15 to 20 different type of neural networks for one specific disease. And what I mean by that is, let's say a patient only has access to blood pressure, pulse ox, and temperature. Well, we have a neural network built for that. It has less sensitivity and specificity than something that's a full-blown, 6-sensor device, but it certainly has accuracy better than just thermal checks for getting in a building. So we can look at neural networks that are tailored to the specific inputs that patient may have access to.
So is this a technology that you're working with the hardware vendor or the hardware manufacturer on, or is this something where you're licensing the NeuTigers technology to the hardware vendor? How exactly does that aspect work?
So we have different market strategy, and there are certainly vendors. For example, we have a kiosk company in the United States where we're partnering and launching our technology with them. We have one watch manufacturer in Europe where we have a partnership with, but other times we've done experiments with watches that we have purchased in the consumer market and used them in our research, and then validated them across similar type watches by adjusting the sample frequency rate. The watches may have different frequency rate for similar types of sensors, and adjusting that and then revalidating them in smaller experiments. So we have all those different types of models where we can just buy a watch and figure out a neural network that'll work with it, to actually partnering with a device manufacturer. And we're not just isolated to smartwatches. We can use any at-home monitoring device depending on the disease state. We're currently looking at trials with EKG monitoring devices and blood pressure monitoring devices, a whole gamut of sensors that are available to us. And as you know, as a tech person, these medical sensors are exploding on the market. Some of them are still untested, but some of them are actually FDA approved and have quite a bit of validation behind them.
Right. Yeah, you look at things like the Apple, the iWatch and things like that, where the sensors are embedded in, and they're still getting approvals for different uses. So I see this as that's obviously limited to the Apple Watch, but yours has what I imagine is similar technology, but used in any form factor.
Correct. That's exactly right. And you can imagine you can't fit every single at-home monitoring device on a watch because the skin contact may be not conducive to specific physiologic inputs it needs to take. You may have to put devices elsewhere on the body. An example is that we've worked with a company that makes implants into soles that looks at different pressure on the foot, and we're looking at analytics to see can we predict potential overuse injuries or exhaustion, or even looking at Parkinson's disease. So there's a number of use cases that clearly wouldn't be a watch use case. They would be some other sensor. And we can combine all those sensors if we need to.
And is this technology considered, more of a monitoring technology? Is it considered a diagnostic, or is there a little bit of both in there?
Yeah, there's definitely a little bit of both in there. And I will tell you how the company got started is the founder, who is a research scientist and professor at Princeton University, actually did experiments with a smartwatch and his neural networks, which he's the inventor of, to look if he can actually diagnose disease, not monitor disease, but diagnose. And he, again, has peer-reviewed literature on being able to differentiate patients who are healthy versus patients who have type 1 diabetes versus patients who have type 2 diabetes. He was actually able to differentiate all three cohorts with a neural network. He actually then launched into mental health disorders, and believe it or not, he was able to do this in mental health disorders. And this was several years back, and when the COVID crisis hit, NeuTigers was very interested in seeing if we can actually make inferences on the likelihood of COVID, and we have been successful. Our data is showing in the 90% and greater sensitivity and specificity with fairly low false positive and false negative rates. And that's validated against not only nasal PCR, which is the gold standard, but also with a world-renowned infectious disease expert who, there are some cases of COVID that are true cases, but the nasal PCR doesn't detect them well. We double validated them, not only with nasal PCR, but with infectious disease experts validating that they had the classic pattern of COVID. So, and we found ourselves to be extremely sensitive and specific for that disorder as a diagnostic capability, although we would use it more as a screening apparatus as opposed to a definitive diagnostic apparatus, mainly because that's probably where the market will allow it.
Right. And you mentioned diabetes. Is this something that could be, ultimately used as a glucose monitoring type of application? Does it allow for sensing at that level, or I guess it would depend on the hardware. If the hardware could sense the glucose, then it would be able to be used.
So that's a pretty big device sector. We have not gone into that yet. Our main focus has been exacerbation of disease. So we could detect somebody who, and I can't use that strong of language. We haven't done it yet. But I can imagine we can build a paradigm that detects somebody going into something called diabetic ketoacidosis, which is a very severe diabetic crisis. We could warn somebody that they're going to go into that with the proper scientific method and developing a model. It would take some time to develop that, but I'm confident now that we've been in mental health, infectious disease, and physiologic diseases that probably a lot of diseases could be there could be early warning systems for all of them. But as far as monitoring exact glucose, of course, that's probably going to be, I'm not sure you necessarily need machine learning for that specific case, because you're probably only looking at one data point, which is blood glucose. Now, if you were going to try to put a bunch of physiologic signals together as surrogates for the blood glucose, maybe. I just don't think it would be as accurate as doing something that targets just one data point, which is blood glucose, and I don't think machine learning would be necessary for that.
And one area that we haven't even discussed, and I would imagine there's a huge number of applications or opportunity, and that would be for sports and training and physical fitness, like that whole area. I mean, are you you mentioned working with a soul, but that was for, Parkinson's and, for disease. Are there definitely opportunities in the sports, area?
There are huge opportunities. We have definitely knocked on those doors, but decided as a startup that we needed to focus on a specific market sector. I absolutely see that as a huge market sector at some point. Right now, we're trying to tackle diseases that are affecting people, but certainly monitoring injury, monitoring recovery from injury, those are all plausible scenarios for neural networks and wearable sensors, not necessarily watches, but any wearable sensor that an athlete can put on their body. We certainly would be interested in doing that, but we don't want to spread our thin off our main mission right now. I will say that where we see our target market is in telehealth, and the reason is because clinicians now seeing patients over telehealth might not have that tactile sense of how the patient's doing because they're not seeing them in person in their office. And we are theorizing that physician over a video conference may be more likely to admit a patient because they're not as confident of how the patient's status is. But having at-home monitoring devices mixed with neural networks, helping that clinician with inferences is ripe to make telemedicine maybe even the de facto way to provide care because of the ability, the convenience to the patient, but also the unbelievable amount of data you could get from that pairing of at-home devices and platforms like this. So that's our heavy push, is to partner with telehealth companies and deploying this technology to make us all much cheaper and higher value providers to patients.
Yeah, I have to say, as someone who went through a pandemic physical, had my annual physical through telehealth. It was almost like just having an opportunity to chat with the doctor about a few things. There was no blood pressure reading, there was no weight and height, there was no checking of different parameters or biometrics. That aspect was missing, and I really felt like the physical was lacking because of that. There wasn't the lab work done. There wasn't, a lot of the hands-on wasn't there, and it was great to be able to see my doctor, but it seemed like such a large piece was missing that this type of monitoring, certainly combined with telehealth, would be a huge upgrade.
Yeah, we agree. You take a subjective encounter and start making it more objective, and that is absolutely where we think our market strategy is. Right.
All right. Well, I know you've said you want to remain focused on your outlined areas of the specific areas you already mentioned. But can you give us an idea of what might be on the radar after that initial rollout?
Yeah. So the one thing we are cognizant of is making diagnostic devices are, in essence, is screening for disease. It may not be the most efficient use of healthcare dollars. So most of our focus will be at monitoring already diagnosed disease, even though we are fairly confident we can make a number of inferences for screening for disease. But after that, we are looking at use cases for looking at early classification of Alzheimer's disease. We're looking at certainly, we're looking at use cases in the sports sector. We have had several conversations, and I'm not going to mention clients, but several big-name clients in the United States who are interested in partnering with us to monitor athletes. That has been talked about in our ranks, and it's certainly a sector we may move into, but that would be after we launch these products that we have in the research pipeline right now. Right.
Well, I mean, it's great. It certainly sounds like very interesting technology, and I'm glad you were able to take some time to share the insights with us. Unfortunately, though, that is all the time we have for this episode of Medtech Matters. I'd like to thank my guest, Dr. Greg Nicola, of NeuTigers, for sharing his insights and the technology with us. And as always, I'd like to thank you, the listener, for tuning in. So until next time, this has been Sean Fensky, Editor-in-Chief of MPO, saying thanks for listening.